also thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. It's a big pleasure. So I will pick up where Bela left it. The question that I cannot say I will answer it, but at least I ask it, right? So why do some countries in East Central Europe decided to join the euro, some of them early on, some after the crisis, and why did other countries not join the euro? And although this panel is somehow labeled under economics, I don't think economics can tell us the story. So we have to look for politics, and I will make, it's more a narrative that I do for two cases, the Hungarian and the Latvian case, and the narrative builds on so what were initial transformational choices and institutions, and how has the crisis reinforced these choices and institutions. Let me shortly tell, I mean, what we see, I know the quality of slides here in this room is or what you can see is very bad, but so on the above is the Hungarian euro coin, which is a trial, right? So somebody had high hopes in the beginning of the EU accession, and there is the Hungarian parliament on it, and it's written the Hungarian Republic. If they would no join, I think there would be no parliament, and there is no republic anymore, so it would be the two rule or some kind of very national identity symbol. And this is the case with Latvia, actually, and this refers back to what Bela was saying. So the Latvian 2 euro coin, it's the folk maiden, which is a kind of nationalist symbol for a maiden, an agricultural, earthbound Latvian woman. And she was also a symbol, this was on the first independence, Lats already, so in the interwar period, and she was also a symbol for resistance against the German and then the Soviet occupation. So I mean, there you can already see the politics. I mean, money is never about economics alone. Often it is not even about economics, but it is about politics and identity and security. Okay, this is the structure of my paper. I will see how far I get in my 20 minutes. So what I do in the paper, I give a short overview over the EUA trajectories, thoughts and away from EMU, before and after the crisis, and also walk you through what the normal economics explanation would be, which, as I said, does not really work. And then I will look at the stability culture in Latvia and its lack in Hungary. So I will ask, why is it that in Latvia we actually have from the beginning on a kind of stability culture? Why don't we have it in Hungary? Then I will look at the Great Divide after the crisis, so Hungary's unorthodox economic policies. Professor Inotai already talked a little bit about it, which leads the country much further away towards a financial nationalism, basically, versus Latvia's escape into the euro. Both were not clear choices, but this is what these countries have chosen. And then finally, I'm not sure I have time, but I will also ask the question, so European Monetary Union in Eastern Europe after the crisis, so has the what can we see from these two cases? Has the EU really learned anything in terms of what kind of members to admit and how to deal with members that cannot comply? Or basically, does this show that there are new crises, euro crisis ahead, right? This is a lot of data, and I don't want to walk you through all the data. I just want to make a couple of brief remarks. If you look at the convergence indicators, so the normal Maastricht criteria, it is only Hungary that really falls out from those who would have qualified in the early, in the early accession period. All the other countries, they did not do well on the inflation business, but in terms of public debt and public deficit, they would have qualified for EU accession, EMU accession. So it's not the compliance or not compliance with criteria which kind of explains why they don't exceed. Then the second observation, there are basically three groups of countries. So one, the early EMU members, Slovakia and Slovenia, and we have close followers, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And basically the only thing that kept Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia out of the euro before the crisis was that they could not meet the inflation criteria. So they were in ERM2 very early on. They had very fixed pegged exchange rates. And the reason, I mean, this is well known why they had this high inflation. It's a high catch-up growth which was then, and because of their peculiar exchange rate mechanism, they basically had no monetary policy instruments in their hand to do anything about it, so they had runaway inflation. You can also see this in the real effective exchange rate. Basically, their currency got very overvalued, so it was from that point of view, the inflation derailed them on the way to EMU entry. But it's interesting, one last thing, the share of foreign forex loans, or if you want, informal euroization. This is high in the Baltic states, and this is high in Hungary as well, which is a kind of weird combination, right? But then the laggard countries, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, they basically, Czech Republic and Poland had this problem to a much greater, lesser degree. If we look at the same indicators, but from 2009 to 2013, we see that 2 of the laggard countries joined EMU. Lithuania hopes to join in 2015, of the close followers, sorry, and that the laggard countries not only did not join, but they went further away. So Hungary has now a floating exchange rate. Before it had a pact or a kind of pact exchange rate, and the other 2 countries went further away. So we have to, and what you also see is that the Baltic countries, so the laggard countries that now joined, paid an enormous price for this, because as I said, they had very overvalued currencies. They had to pursue internal devaluation, and their currency is not basically very competitive compared to the baseline 2005, which means that they still cannot gain their competitiveness from any kind of from the currency. So the question here really is, why did they decide not to devaluate when the crisis hit, rather than joining the euro, right? So if we look at this pattern of which countries are laggards, which countries are followers, and which countries entered, so the normal explanation is basically the size. Béla mentioned this already, population size, but population doesn't mean anything. It's trade openness and integration, real economic integration with the European Union countries, or the core countries. Now, if we look at the numbers, it's very inconclusive, and what they mostly tell you is that the countries that really joined the euro are not necessarily the ones, with the exception of Slovakia and Slovenia, that should have joined based on these criteria. Population size, yes. Population, it's the small countries, but I don't see how just the fact whether you have 1 million or 5 million people matters for EMU entry. Nobody can spell me out the logic. If we look at the economic logic, the trade share of GDP is basically much higher or as high in the laggard countries than among the EMU members, and especially Latvia and Lithuania, it is much lower. So that would not explain. And then the share of EU 27, I mean, there are other data which only go for the core, and this confirms this. Basically, again, the laggard countries are higher integrated in their exports to the core EU than the 2 laggard countries, or the 3 laggard countries. 2 of them moved, Estonia, Latvia, and then Lithuania, right? So the real puzzle is actually here, the Baltic states on the one hand, what made them join, whereas the laggard countries, which on economic indicators look much closer to the EMU core, and also what Béla was saying in the morning, also the export structure is much more integrated, much more similar, so why don't they join? From these tables I derive 3 puzzles, and again I can probably not answer all of them, but the first one is, why have some countries such as Latvia or Lithuania, to a lesser extent Estonia, which lag behind in real convergence, meaning the similarity, pursued the euro entry early on, and what made countries like Hungary and the Czech Republic, who were pace setters in real convergence, postpone? Second puzzle, why has the crisis strengthened the resolve of the Baltic states to join the euro, engage in painful internal devaluation to reach this aim, and still face the disadvantages of an overvalued exchange rate? And why has the crisis in turn strengthened the resolve of the laggard countries to stay outside of the euro? And the final puzzle, why did the EU accept Latvia's quest for EMU entry in 2014, when the euro crisis had revealed the dangers of nominal and real economic divergence for the eurozone, and while it refused to accept Lithuania as a member in the euro, to the euro in 2006, basically, when the only difference was 0.1 inflation differential to the 3 best performing countries, right? So why was the EU harsh in 2006 and now is actually quite lenient in 2014-13? Okay, so as I said, I focus on 2 countries. The reason is these are the most puzzling, if you want. Hungary is among the closely integrated economically with the EU and is the country that went most extreme in its policy choices not to join the euro and anything else. Latvia is, together with Lithuania, in that sense the least integrated in terms of exports and so on with the EU, but Latvia had also had the steepest crisis, steepest recession in the crisis, and had to undergo the most painful internal devaluation in order to reach its goal. So these are the extreme cases on this variety that I showed you. So I look closer at them. And the basic explanation for Latvia what set the country on the path to euro early on were this is my explanation basically, its initial choices about its economic model, which are rooted in the transformation strategy, and that is very similar to all other Baltic countries, that basically very radical economic reforms and the rapid introduction of a national currency was closely tied to the agenda of national independence. It was a security issue, it was a national identity issue, and the institutional setting followed from there. So it was not an economic issue. It was a security and national identity issue. This also led to the fact that the independent central bank became a hegemonic institution. So it is an institution which is really widely regarded as the one major non-corrupt and functioning institution which really has meaning for the whole new nation state as a whole. This is different from political parties and whatever you want. So it's the central bank as the hegemonic institution. And then the third reason, the political opposition to fiscal discipline and its corollary, a lean state and a meager welfare state, was stifled because of Latvia's exclusionary democracy. Basically, initially the citizenship rights basically denied the Russian population, Russian-speaking population, the vote, and until now, we find it also in the party system that basically so ethnic cleavages sit above socioeconomic cleavages and they cannot be articulated. So that's my explanation for stability culture in Latvia. Very briefly, the vulnerabilities, I showed it already on the table. So this currency board-like arrangement makes it that there is no monetary policy autonomy, and the extreme high catch-up growth of this country, and then the bubble basically led to very high inflation, which derailed the whole exchange rate and real competitiveness and everything else. The Hungarian story. Hungary does not, to put it simple, and I think most of us know it, does not have a stability culture, right? It simply does not have it. So why is this? First thing is, it inherited a major welfare state from socialism. And it expanded this welfare state even after, in the initial years of transformation. So Peter van Husse talks about the abnormal pensioners boom here. So, you know, you add a lot of early retirement people and you blow up your budget, right? This is the first, but more countries in the region did this. For Hungary, there is another explanation. It's an increasingly polarized party system and cutthroat party competition, which basically led to a politics of outbidding in terms of public expenditure. So what you basically have, no party dares, after the Bokros package, dares to touch the welfare state. It's a no-go area. So what you basically, when you're in opposition, you tell what you would still do in order to add something, layers to the welfare state, right? And when you are in government, you don't dare to deviate from it. So this is another major chunk of why the public finances basically derailed in that country. And the third element of it is that polarized politics also often pitted central bank governors against governments. So you typically had central bank governors who wanted politicians to rein in the deficit, But central bank governors typically were not from the same party color as politicians, so you had this struggle between the two because the government wanted the central bankers to basically first devalue the currency and then they would do something to have growth and so on. So anyway, there was a lot, I mean, basically the cooperation between central bank and governments rarely worked in that country, and that is an additional layer to this derailing of public finance. Then the consequences, and this is, I think, is the major one. Hungary adopted a really ill-conceived mix of monetary and fiscal policies, which basically stifled growth and competitiveness and added to the problems during the 2000s. And then, because of this increasingly polarized politics, party competition and legitimacy issue increasingly paralyzed policy making as well. So there was a policy drift as well. Now, very briefly, we heard about this a little bit already. What happened after the crisis? Both countries were very hard hit by the crisis. Both had to go, and this is how the Hungarian story started, to the IMF and the EU for a bailout in 2008. And this was pretty much before this happened in Western Europe. So basically, this was also the experimental field for trying out the new conditionality, the new EMU conditionality. So that's interesting too. But the thing is, so in 2008, Hungary, at that time a socialist government, had to go to the IMF. They got the typical, you have to cut and you have to raise taxes and I don't know what. And for a number of reasons, that government was already incredibly unpopular, the socialists at that time, and that basically killed the government. So what we had in 2010 is very well known. We had basically, when Greece was not yet a problem, Orban came to power and he started outrightly to tell the EU, we don't do what you want from us. We invent our own economic model. Our own economic model has a couple of elements. The first one is, we do one thing what you want from us. We rein in public finances and we stabilize the deficit. But we do it our own way. We tax the banks heavily. We let the banks who were responsible for our crisis, let them pay for it. We blood them. We basically protect those people who took out foreign currency loans. We build up programs for them. The banks have to pay for it. We politicize the central bank so that the central bank and the government can go together hand in hand and work together hand in hand for our new growth strategy. And then you can go basically fuck yourself. I'm sorry, but this is basically what the country says. So this is the first campaign in 2012. The first time it says go fuck yourself was to the IMF, saying we pay all the money back. What we want is respect and we want trust. And what we basically, what we tell the IMF, you don't interfere in our economic policy. And the same message was sent again, and this is a popular message, so let's not forget about that. Orban was re-elected for a number of reasons. There was a lot of electoral stuff going on, but there is also a popular base for his project. So the same message was sent to the European. This was the campaign for the European Parliament, and the only thing what basically the message consisted of the governing party is to say we want respect. Our message to Brussels is respect the Hungarians, right? So this is, and the whole freedom fight is basically it's identity politics, which, however, achieves two things, even if with short-term and one-off measures, but it kind of tries to take care of the public finance as well. The Latvian story is the concrete opposite. So Latvia also had to go to the IMF and the EU for an emergency loan. It had, as I said, the deepest the deepest recession from all the countries. And the way it addressed this is basically defending hand and toe its currency peg, because the idea is we exit into the eurozone in order, and then we basically get rid of all the pressures we have on our economy. Why did the country do this, despite the fact that this involved the most severe adjustment package? It basically did it partly because of this identity business. This still was a very important one, and partly and also that the political opposition again could not electorally get through. It was strong, but it could not electorally get through, and partly because the Swedish banks had a high stake there, because it was basically their banks that were mostly engaged in the country, and they had the foreign currency loans, and basically Swedish government, Swedish banks, and then the EU, much more than the IMF, basically asked the country to keep the currency peg at all costs and enter into the euro. So I think I'm almost done with my time. Let me just very briefly, so it entered the euro. This is a conclusion. Is the new economic governance working? For Hungary, I mean, what we see basically by new economic governance, I mean, the renewed understanding of the EU that if the EMU should work, you need a financial system which is stable, you need public finances which are basically sustainable, and so on. And what the Hungarian story shows is that the EU is not able to enforce this on a member state. Now, Hungary is out of the euro, but the real political story that is behind here is how much is the Hungarian freedom fight a role model for other countries, right, inside the eurozone, who also have enough from austerity and so on. So that is the political question, and this is the one that the EU is completely unable to tackle, completely unable. The Latvian case basically, I mean, Latvia was admitted, despite it being, I shorten this now very much, being the new Cyprus in terms of shady business model, despite not having a sustainable low inflation rate, this is explicitly mentioned in the same words as with Lithuania, and despite the economy not really being very competitive, as Béla showed earlier. So the main thing here is, I think, this was an EU decision also to say, on the one hand, the EMU was in crisis, so it's great that the country wants to join, so let's take that country, we need a success story. And the other is austerity can work. This is a showcase for austerity can work. And therefore my predictions for the eurozone, that's it.